Welcome to the fifth and final session of the Texas A&M Online Orientation for New University Supervisors. This session focuses on the Cooperating Teacher folder, its purpose, and its content. In order to follow along with the audio for this session, it will be especially important to have copies of the handouts that will be included in the Cooperating Teachers folder. As you see on the first slide, we begin with a handout entitled Contents of the Sample Cooperating Teacher folder. This page is for your use only. I do not include this page in the mentoring folder itself. The handouts listed on the contents page are a suggestion based on the materials that I actually provide my cooperating teachers each semester. You may certainly add to or delete from this list. So you will prepare folders with handouts containing mentoring information similar to the examples that you are about to see. Hand deliver the mentoring folders to each cooperating teacher's classroom or school mailbox. Do this at least 1 week prior to the clinical teacher's official first day. This will give cooperating teachers time to read the content and make note of questions. It will also give them time to contact you to answer any questions they may have. On the next slide, you see the first suggestion for the mentoring folder. It is a sample of a cover page. Looking at the sample cover page, see the note at the top. There is a suggestion that you staple your version of this page to the outside of each mentoring folder. From my experience, it's more likely that this page will be read as soon as the folder is received simply because it is on the outside of the folder. Remember, you are to hand deliver the folder to each cooperating teacher's classroom or school mailbox at least 1 week prior to the clinical teacher's arrival. To repeat, this page, as with every page that's been provided, is to be used as an example only. In other words, you are empowered to compose your own informational pages based off of these sample pages. Next is the sample of the first page inside the mentoring folders that I give to my cooperating teachers. It is the welcome memo or letter. Compose a memo similar to this one, introducing yourself and or explaining general information about the clinical teaching semester. Be sure to emphasize the importance of written feedback from the cooperating teacher. Note the third paragraph where it says that written feedback from the cooperating teacher is a vital part of the clinical teaching semester. 2 options for written feedback from the cooperating teacher are listed. The first option is a journal or spiral that can be handwritten or typed. The second option is to use observation forms that can be printed from an online link. It's good to include at least one sample observation form in your folder. You may certainly add more options for written feedback. Stress that the cooperating teacher must observe and fill out the formal observation form at least once prior to the midpoint conference and at least once between the midpoint conference and the final conference. The next slide is the miscellaneous handout entitled General Reminders, Dates, and Policies. Find your copy of this handout. This handout serves as a summary of the basic information for our 14 plus or 70 full field days plus career fair in our clinical teaching semester. It is a useful source of information for experienced and novice cooperating teachers. Reading through this handout will also help you as a new supervisor. It will enforce, once again, the overwhelming amount of information that has been given to you in these 5 audio sessions. You will see that it is not only a great go-to page for cooperating teachers, but for new supervisors as well. Let's quickly read through the headings and focus on a few topics that were not discussed in the previous audio sessions. The title is General Reminders, Dates, and Policies. First of all, share your contact information. The following topics are addressed: Clinical Teaching Handbook, the start date, the orientation seminar, the ending date for clinical teachers, the lesson planning seminar, arrival and departure time. Here I state that being on time each day is important and that our clinical teachers should be in the classroom at least 10 minutes before students arrive or earlier if your school requires this, and stay at school each day as long as the cooperating teachers are required to stay. Attendance and absences. I state that on a daily basis the clinical teacher will Enter arrival and departure times on an attendance log, and that it is the clinical teacher's daily responsibility to ask the cooperating teacher to initial that day's data, indicating that the cooperating teacher agrees with it. I know that throughout the audio sessions, this has been stressed over and over again, but that's because the state is strict on the documentation of attendance. Full responsibility and the pacing schedule are briefly explained. The role of the clinical teaching notebook is explained. Professional responsibilities are addressed, as is the career fair. The substitution policy that is fairly new to our program is explained. Clinical teachers may not serve as paid substitutes during the clinical teaching semester. If a clinical teacher does serve as a paid sub during the clinical teaching semester, this day is considered an unexcused absence. Clinical teachers must make up 2 days for each unexcused absence. For the last bullet, note that I've stressed the importance of written feedback from the cooperating teacher. I've written that it serves to validate a positive experience, but also provides written documentation on problems should that be the case. I've suggested that the cooperating teacher give as much written feedback as he or she wishes, but it is suggested that the cooperating teacher critique at least one lesson a week or summarize in writing the strengths and weaknesses of his or her clinical teacher at least once a week. The next slide is a continuation of this handout. There's detailed information on the cooperating teacher's options for written feedback. This includes the spiral journal option. This informal approach allows the cooperating teacher to give written feedback pertaining to any part of the day, including instruction, one-on-one interactions with students, classroom management, transitions, etc. The second bullet discusses written documentation in a formal format. For this option, there are various forms available for the cooperating teacher at the link provided. The last bullet explains the requirement for cooperating teachers using the formal observation form. Be sure to remind the cooperating teacher that he or she is to evaluate the clinical teacher as compared to other clinical teachers rather than experienced classroom teachers. Observations by the university supervisor are discussed. Also, there is information on the midpoint and final conferences, which were explained in detail in previous audio sessions. Do note the online requirement by the cooperating teacher for his or her midpoint and final evaluation forms. Also remind the cooperating teacher about using the CEHD data portal to submit a recommendation for standard certification after the final conference. Next is the weekly plan of action for cooperating teachers. It's a week-by-week reference with a timeline of what will be happening and when during the 14 plus or 70 days plus career fair semester of clinical teaching. Even though this is a handout created for cooperating teachers, it will be helpful for you as a novice university supervisor. It will help reinforce all the information that you've been hearing about in the previous 4 audio sessions. Use this as a guide for composing your own weekly plan of action so cooperating teachers will know what is happening and when it is happening. We're not reading through all of the information on this handout. Aren't you glad? We will simply skim through it because most of this information has already been mentioned in previous audio sessions. Looking at the weekly plan of action for cooperating teachers. Note that there are suggestions on what the cooperating teacher can do prior to the arrival of his or her clinical teacher. Week 1 has a lot of detail, which is especially helpful for a new cooperating teacher. After reading this information, cooperating teachers will know exactly what is expected for the first week. Week 2 is on the next slide. Note the options for written feedback. There are 4 numbered items under this bullet. Be specific with the options when you compose your handout for cooperating teachers. Note the reminder that severe problems are to be reported to the university supervisor immediately. Weeks 3 and 4 discuss the first round of observations. On the next slide, you see weeks 5 and 6. The second observation is discussed, as well as other miscellaneous details. Week 7 focuses on the midpoint conference. Be sure to remind the cooperating teacher that he or she must record the midpoint evaluation results online. Under weeks 8 through 10, there is information on second environment. The next slide is the final page of the sample weekly plan of action. Weeks 11 through 13 discuss the fourth and final observation. Week 4 may extend into week 15 in order to total 70 field days plus career fair. This information focuses on the final conference. Again, be sure to remind each cooperating teacher that he or she must record final evaluation results online. Also, remember to remind cooperating teachers that they must recommend their clinical teachers for standard certification through the CEHD data portal. University supervisors will submit their recommendations separately. The last bullet emphasizes the last important step for the cooperating teacher. The next slide shows the suggested pacing schedule. The pacing schedule is in the handbook on page 22. As I mentioned, the pacing schedule is in the handbook, but it is helpful to include it in the mentoring folder in case the cooperating teacher's not yet had time to read through the entire handbook. The next slide is the attendance log. The clinical teacher is responsible for filling out the arrival and departure times for each day and acquiring an initial each day from the cooperating teacher, indicating that the cooperating teacher agrees with the data entered for that day. The log is included in the mentoring folder so the cooperating teacher will see what it looks like. Be crystal clear in explaining that the cooperating teacher is not responsible for keeping the attendance log up to date. This is the clinical teacher's responsibility. The next 2 slides encompass the handout entitled Lesson Plan Requirements. We have already gone over this in a previous session, so we will not spend any time on it now. Included in the mentoring folder because it will give cooperating teachers details on the lesson planning requirements that are not included in the handbook. These details will help the cooperating teacher better understand what is expected of the clinical teacher. Next is the sample observation form that cooperating teachers may use to critique their clinical teachers. The point is to include an observation form of your choice from the ones available at the link provided for cooperating teachers. Next is the formal observation. It is in the handbook on page 16. Again, include a hard copy of the formal observation in the mentoring folder, even though it is in the handbook. You will, of course, provide the link so that cooperating teachers have access to this form online so that more copies can be printed as they are needed. The last slide is the midpoint final evaluation. This form is in the handbook on page 17. Include a hard copy in the mentoring folder. It will be filled out by the cooperating teacher as well as you for the midpoint conference and again for the final conference. Once again, remember that these handouts are samples of what I give my cooperating teachers. It is fine to use mine as a guide. You will tweak each one so that it is a reflection of you and your personal style of mentoring. Remember, if questions crop up, and they will during the semester, go online and access the appropriate audio PowerPoint session that will address your questions. If you are still unable to find an answer to your question, please contact either me or the Office of Field Experiences. My contact information is available at the bottom of the overview handout from Session 1. I hope you have a rewarding semester as you supervise one or more of our clinical teachers. I'll end session 5 with Gig 'em. This is Sandy Johnson, class of 72.